Step 6 in the Arnold Rendering Guide is how we output ambient occlusion. For your CGI Production Module, this is optional, however I highly recommend you follow these steps to set up ambient occlusion for your scene. It won't add much to the render time, but it will add a lot to the actual final render when you composite the ambient occlusion on top in After Effects. So in order to do that, I'm going to just close the render settings tab, and we are going to use the render layers. So if we click that, we open the little checkerboard with like the 2 layers. We open up our render layers tab, and we're just going to create a layer quickly. So just follow these steps exactly for ambient occlusion. So we click this little button here which adds a new layer, and I'm just going to call this AO for ambient occlusion, and then I'm going to right click on that and click create collection. And a collection is just a collection of objects or lights or anything. And so because my scene is nice and tidy, I can just grab these 3 groups and add them, and that's all the geometry in my scene has been added to this collection group. At the moment we're looking at the original scene, which has got all our beauty and everything in it. If I click here now, I'm looking at the ambient occlusion layer, and then I'm going to right click on the collection and choose create shader override. Okay, and then what that's going to do is it's going to override any of the shaders that we're using on these objects in the collection with a shader that we specify. So I'm going to click this little checkerboard here, and I'm going to start typing AMB for ambient occlusion, and we can see we have an AI ambient occlusion shader, and I'm going to click that. And we can see that everything's gone grey now, and that's because rather than my original shaders that I'd used, everything now just has an ambient occlusion shader on it. I'm going to check off this little render icon here on the scene for now, because I want to render the ambient occlusion layer. So for some reason, if you have your output denoising AOV selected, we won't be able to see what the ambient occlusion is doing. So I'm just going to uncheck that so that I can render and check what my ambient occlusion is doing. So at the minute, this is my ambient occlusion pass, and it's kind of a grayscale capture of the ambient shadows. So we have darker shadows where objects you know, are near each other. At the moment, this is not exactly what I would want for an ambient occlusion pass. So what we're going to do is just minimize that. We're going to select any object in our scene and go to the ambient occlusion shader, and I'm just going to give it some fall off. So let's try a value of 0.7. This is going to depend on your scene size. Just going to save that image and render again. Okay, that's a bit better. So whereas before we were getting like greys all over the image, and we were getting greys in areas where it was just a flat plane where there wouldn't be any ambient shadow, now we're just getting shadowing kind of in the cracks of objects and where they're near each other, because basically we're going to take this image and multiply it over the top of our beauty. So I would say that that's okay. I might just try tweaking the fall off, turning it down a little bit, so maybe 0.6 would work. Let's see what we get with that. Okay, so I'm happy with that. The initial settings we're giving us this. which basically was showing there was shadowing everywhere, which is not what we want when we're trying to create ambient shadow. So this is a good example of ambient occlusion. And we can see that if I just move this out of the way, it only took 23 seconds to render at 1080. So it really doesn't add much to your render times. So I'm happy with that. And that's ambient occlusion set up. So what we just need to do now is go back to our render settings and just turn on output denoising AOVs, because we turn that off to be able to preview it. And what we're going to do is look back at our beauty, okay, and turn on the clapperboard for that. So basically what we're doing now is we're telling Maya, I want you to render this master layer, this scene, okay, but then once you've finished rendering that, I also want you to render ambient occlusion by having both of those turned on. If we turn this off, Maya's just going to render ambient occlusion, so we need to remember to turn that back on. And we will see that we have two render layers up here now. We have a master layer, and so Maya's going to save into a folder called master layer, and then the scene name, and then here it's going to save into an AO folder, the scene name.